The greatest threat to Russia isn't NATO. It's not economic sanctions, and it's not even the war in Ukraine. It's something much quieter but far more dangerous: Russia's own population collapse. Surprising as it may seem, the Russian government has known about this problem for decades. They've tried all sorts of strategies to turn things around, but none have really made a difference. Back in 2006, Vladimir Putin himself called the demographic crisis Russia's most urgent issue and even urged Russian women to have more children and focus on starting families. But fast forward 20 years later, and despite those efforts, little has changed, except that the situation has only gotten worse. In this video, we're going to take a look at Russia's demographic crisis. We'll break down what's happening, why it's happening, and what it could mean for Russia's future. From the plummeting birth rates and mass immigration to the effects of the ongoing war, we'll explore why this challenge might be Russia's toughest yet, one with consequences that could reach far beyond its borders. And believe it or not, alcohol, particularly vodka, might be playing a bigger role in Russia's decline than you think. We'll dig into that in a minute, but first, let's look at where things stand today. Before that, be sure to hit the like button below. Any video criticizing Putin has a chance of getting downvoted by Putin's bots to kill its reach in the algorithm, so you can help us fight that. Let's begin. Right now, Russia's fertility rate is hovering around 1.5 births per woman. To put that into perspective, a stable population needs a fertility rate of about 2.1. 2 births to replace mom and dad, and the extra 0.1% is crucial because it accounts for those who might not make it to adulthood. Anything below this number means that over time, a country's population starts shrinking, and for Russia, that's exactly what's happening. A declining population means fewer people entering the workforce. As fewer children are born each year, the number of young people entering the job market begins to decline. This isn't just a problem for businesses looking to hire, but it's also a systematic issue that affects the entire economy. With fewer working-age people, the pressure on those still in the workforce grows significantly. They're not only supporting themselves, but also an increasing number of retirees who depend on pensions and healthcare services. As the population ages and more people leave the workforce, the strain on those social support systems only gets heavier. A shrinking workforce means fewer taxpayers, which translates to less revenue flowing into the government's coffers. This becomes a major problem when it comes to funding essential services like pensions, healthcare, and education. When the government struggles to maintain these programs, people start to feel more financially insecure, and that insecurity often has a direct effect on birth rates. When the future feels uncertain, jobs are hard to come by, wages aren't growing, and living costs keep climbing, people tend to postpone starting families or decide to have fewer kids. It creates a vicious cycle where economic stress and low birth rates feed into each other, making the situation even harder to fix. This demographic problem becomes even more striking when you think about how big the country is. Russia's absolutely massive, stretching over 17 million square kilometers, making it the biggest country in the world. It covers 11 different time zones, reaching from Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. To give you an idea of how huge it is, you could take the entire United States or China, fit them within Russia's borders, and there would still be room to spare, almost half of the space left over. Yet, despite its massive size, Russia's population is only about 143 million people as of 2024. Now, 143 million might sound like a lot, but once you start comparing, you realize just how small that number really is. Take Bangladesh, for example. It's a country that's over 116 times smaller than Russia, but it's packed with more than 170 million people. That means that Bangladesh has almost 30 million more people than Russia, squeezed into a much smaller space. And it's not just Bangladesh. Look at Japan, 125 million people living in 377,000 square kilometers. Russia's about 45 times bigger than Japan in terms of land area, yet Japan's population is not that far behind. So even though Russia is a massive country, it doesn't have a massive population to match. These are just 2 examples, and there are many more. At least now you know just how unique and challenging Russia's demographic situation is. Just think about Siberia and the Russian Far East. Combined, these regions cover over 10 million square kilometers, which is more than the entire land area of the United States. Yet the whole Far Eastern Federal District has fewer than 8 million residents. That's less than a city like New York or London. Now, you might wonder why these regions are so empty. Well, a big reason is that after the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, the government couldn't keep supporting these far-flung regions the way they used to. Back in the Soviet days, there was this big push to develop Siberia and the Russian Far East. They sent miners, industrial workers, and their families out there with promises of jobs and decent living standards. Places like Chukotka, Matagan, and Kamchatka were buzzing with activity. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the funding. The industries were shut down, and the people who had moved east started to head back west. They packed up and left for Moscow, St. Petersburg, or just left Russia altogether, looking for better opportunities. As a result, a lot of these towns have been left practically deserted. Some of them are now on the brink of becoming ghost towns. It's kind of like those old Wild West towns in the US that thrived during a gold rush and then just disappeared when the gold dried up. But in Russia, it's on a much bigger scale. Take Norilsk, for example, one of the largest cities in the Arctic. It's way up in northern Siberia and is known for being a big player in nickel mining. The city is still economically important, but its population has completely flatlined. The younger generation isn't sticking around anymore. Instead, they're leaving for places like Moscow, where they think there's more opportunity and a better quality of life. And honestly, who can blame them? Living in a remote, freezing place like Norilsk isn't exactly everyone's dream. This same story repeats in Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, further down in the Russian Far East. These places have history, culture, and natural beauty, but the younger folks often leave. They head off to European Russia, where things are a bit more connected and modern, or they even leave the country entirely, seeking better prospects abroad. And here's the thing. It's not just about personal choices or economic reasons. It's also about the impact this has on the country as a whole. When people leave these remote regions, it makes it harder for Russia to maintain its presence and influence in those areas. Places like Siberia and the Russian Far East are incredibly rich in natural resources like oil, gas, minerals, you name it. But with fewer people living there, it becomes tougher to develop these areas and keep the local economy going. On top of that, the harsh climate of these regions plays a huge role too. It's tough to convince people to live in a place where winters last most of the year and the nearest major city is 1,000 kilometers away. Without enough people, it's hard for these areas to develop the infrastructure they need, like schools, hospitals, and modern amenities. It creates a vicious cycle. People leave because life is tough, and life stays tough because there aren't enough people. But if we look at the other end of the spectrum, Moscow tells a different story. While much of Russia's hinterlands struggle with depopulation, Moscow is growing. It's now home to over 13 million people, with the wider metropolitan area reaching nearly 21.5 million. This makes Moscow not only the largest city in Russia, but also one of the largest in Europe. St. Petersburg has also seen growth, though on a smaller scale, rising from 4.7 million in 2002 to about 5.6 million today. So when you put all this together, you can start to see why Russia's demographic issue is such a big deal. The country has this enormous amount of land, but it's struggling to keep its population spread out across it. Sure, Moscow and St. Petersburg are bustling hubs with millions of residents, but the farther you go from these cities, the emptier things get. And in a country like Russia, that can have serious implications, not just for the economy, but for things like national security and regional stability too. But how did it get this bad? To really understand this, we have to go back in time, way back, to the early days of the 20th century. The roots of Russia's demographic issues run deep, all the way through revolutions, Stalin's brutal purges, and the devastating patriotic war that left a lasting impact on the population. You see, it all started with the revolutions of the early 1900s. The Russian Empire, which had ruled for centuries, came crashing down in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. That year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the monarchy and established the Soviet Union. But the transition wasn't smooth, far from it. The Bolshevik takeover plunged the country into a brutal civil war that would last from 1917 to 1923, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against the anti-Bolshevik White Army, which included various factions, monarchists, and foreign intervention forces. This conflict was not confined to battlefields. It swept through cities, towns, and rural areas, tearing apart the social fabric of the country. The Russian Civil War resulted in millions of deaths. Estimates vary, but it's believed that between 7 to 12 million people died due to combat, famine, and disease. The fighting itself claimed the lives of around 2 to 3 million. Entire towns were caught in the crossfire, and atrocities were committed on both sides, leading to a level of brutality that devastated the civilian population. But perhaps even more destructive than the fighting was the famine that struck during this period. With the chaos of war, agriculture production collapsed. Farmers were often caught between the Red and White armies, and their crops and livestock were seized or destroyed. The resulting food shortages led to widespread famine. It's estimated that around 5 million people died of starvation, with entire villages succumbing to hunger. Regions like the Volga Basin in Ukraine were hit particularly hard, with people resorting to eating whatever they could find, like roots and grass. On top of that, epidemics of typhus, cholera, and influenza swept through the population, taking advantage of malnutrition and poor living conditions. The population of the Russian Empire was around 170 million before World War I, but by the end of the Civil War, it had dropped significantly, with estimates suggesting a loss of around 10 to 12 million people in just a few short years. This loss was not just a matter of numbers. It meant that entire generations were decimated, leaving behind a population that was physically weakened. The Civil War also caused mass displacement. As battles raged across the country, millions of people fled their homes, either to escape the fighting or to search for food and safety. Many fled to neighboring countries, creating a massive refugee crisis in Eastern Europe. Some never returned, leaving behind ghost towns and abandoned farms. Families were separated, with children often left orphaned and communities shattered. The displacement didn't just mean that people were moving. It meant that entire communities were being uprooted and destroyed, taking with them the cultural and social ties that had held them together for generations. The loss of millions of people, especially young men, during the Civil War and the associated crises meant that the birth rate took a hit. Beyond the obvious losses of life and displacement, there was a psychological toll that affected the survivors. The trauma of witnessing family members die, of facing starvation, and of seeing one's home destroyed left many with a sense of disillusionment and bitterness. This collective trauma would shape Soviet society in the years that followed, creating a population that was both resilient and scarred by the hardships they'd endured. But the story didn't end there. After the Civil War, the Soviet Union was born, and a new chapter began. The Soviet government, once it had secured power, made efforts to rebuild and reshape the country, but the demographic imbalance was hard to ignore. Joseph Stalin believed that for the Soviet Union to survive and compete with Western powers, it needed to industrialize rapidly. He saw industrialization not just as a path to economic strength, but as a way to cement his control over the country. To achieve this, he launched a series of aggressive policies that included the 5-year plans, beginning in 1928. These plans aimed to speed up the development of heavy industries like steel production, coal mining, and machinery. To fuel this industrial push, the Soviet Union needed resources, manpower, and, crucially, food to support its growing urban workforce. And that's where collectivization came in, a policy that would change the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, especially those in rural areas. Collectivization meant taking away privately owned farms and consolidating them into large state-run collective farms, known as kolkhozes or sovkhozes. The Soviet government argued that this would modernize agriculture, increase food production, and free up labor for factories. But in practice, it was a brutal process that met with widespread resistance. Many farmers, or kulaks as the Soviet propaganda labeled them, didn't want to give up their land, their way of life, or the small measure of independence they'd managed to hold on to. In response, Stalin's regime came down hard. Those who resisted were labeled as enemies of the state and faced harsh punishments. Entire families were branded as kulaks and sent to the Gulag, Soviet prison camps scattered across the remote and freezing reaches of Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. These camps were notorious for their brutal conditions. Prisoners were forced into hard labor in extreme climates, building railways, mining, or logging, with barely enough food to survive. The death toll in the gulags was staggering. It's estimated that between 1.5 to 2 million people died in these camps during the 1930s alone, succumbing to starvation, disease, and exhaustion. But it wasn't just those sent to the Gulag who suffered. The process of collectivization itself unleashed chaos across the Soviet countryside. Farmers who had their land and livestock seized faced the prospect of starvation. Livestock numbers plummeted as desperate peasants slaughtered their animals rather than handing them over to the state. The agricultural disruption caused by this mass upheaval led to severe food shortages, and what followed was one of the darkest chapters in Soviet history, the Holodomor. The Holodomor, which means death by hunger in Ukrainian, took place from 1932 to 1933. It was a man-made famine, driven by Stalin's policies and the forced requisition of grain from the Ukrainian countryside. The Soviet government took the food that Ukrainian farmers produced, often leaving them with nothing to eat. The grain was sold abroad to fund industrial projects, while millions of people back home starved. Estimates suggest that around 3.5 to 7 million people died during the Holodomor. Entire villages were wiped out, and the scenes of suffering were unimaginable. Again, people resorted to eating grass and leaves, and some even resorted to cannibalism in their desperation. The demographic impact of Stalin's policies during this time is hard to overstate. Estimates indicate that the rural birth rate dropped by more than 50% during the peak of the famine. In some areas, it fell to as low as 15 to 20 births per 1,000 people. Families struggling to survive simply couldn't afford to have more children. Communities that had once been tight-knit and self-sufficient were fractured. Their cultural traditions disrupted as people were moved to collective farms or deported to distant regions. The shift of labor from the countryside to the city may have fueled industrial growth, but it left a hollowed-out countryside behind. The forced industrialization did achieve some of its goals. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had built up a significant industrial base. The country was producing more steel, oil, and machinery than ever before, and Stalin boasted that the USSR had caught up with the West. But these achievements came at a terrible cost. The millions who died of starvation, the families torn apart by the Gulag, and the villages that vanished from the map left deep demographic holes that couldn't easily be filled. And then came the purges. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin unleashed what's known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. During this time, he targeted anyone he considered a threat to his power. Political rivals, intellectuals, military officers, and even ordinary citizens. Hundreds of thousands were executed, and millions more were imprisoned in the gulags. But as devastating as the purges were, the most severe blow to Russia's population came during World War II. For Russia, this wasn't just World War II, it was the Great Patriotic War. According to Russians, the Great Patriotic War began on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. The Nazis aimed to conquer the Soviet Union quickly, believing that a swift victory would crush the Soviet regime. But the Soviet Union was determined to fight back, and what followed was a brutal 4-year struggle for survival that engulfed nearly every part of the country. For the Soviet people, this wasn't just a war, it was a fight for their homes, their families, and their very existence. More than 1,700 towns and some 70,000 villages had been all but wiped off the map, along with around 32,000 factories and 65,000 kilometers of railway track. Plus, the human toll of this war was unimaginable. By the time it ended in 1945, over 27 million Soviet citizens had lost their lives. This staggering number includes roughly 8 to 11 million soldiers who fought in some of the war's most brutal battles, like Stalingrad and Kursk. But the devastation didn't stop with the military losses. Millions of Soviet civilians were also caught in the crossfire or directly targeted by Nazi forces. Entire towns and villages were erased from the map, and cities turned into war zones. For many, the war was nothing short of a living nightmare. Reports suggest that around 18.5 million Soviet citizens died throughout World War II. To put this into perspective, the United States suffered about 300,000 combat deaths and 400,000 total deaths during the war. This means that the Soviet Union endured 67 times as many losses as the United States in World War II. One of the most harrowing chapters of World War II was the Siege of Leningrad, a city that endured nearly 900 days of relentless bombardment and blockade by Nazi forces. From September 1941 to January 1944, Leningrad was cut off from supplies and surrounded by German troops who sought to starve the city into submission. With supply lines severed, food in Leningrad became a rare and precious commodity. Rations plummeted to just 125 grams of bread per person per day during the worst periods of the siege, and even then, the bread was often mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. The desperation drove people to extreme measures, like boiling leather belts, shoes, and even wallpaper paste in a desperate attempt to extract any bit of nutrition they could. The war left a profound mark on Russia's demographics. In fact, if you look at the population pyramid of the Russian Federation today, you can still see the echo of World War II moving through their society. A population pyramid typically reflects the distribution of different age groups in a society. In healthy growing populations, it resembles a true pyramid. Growing populations have more youth at the bottom than aging people at the top. Stable populations look like pillars. Russia's pyramid looks like a choppy and uneven wave. That's because every 30 years, the generation connected to World War II produces far fewer people than the generations around them. More than 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives during the war, people who might have married, had children, and kept the cycle of life going. Instead, many of them died on the front lines, in sieges, or under Nazi occupation. With so many lives lost, there simply weren't enough people left to start new families once the war was over. This drop in birth rates didn't just disappear, it left a lasting mark on Russia's demographics. It's like a ripple effect that stretches across time. Every 30 years or so, the impact of those losses resurfaces as each smaller generation leads to another, continuing the cycle of population decline. World War II killed roughly 14% of the Russian population. Unless the couples in the generations connected to World War II decided to have 4 to 6 children each, there was no way for the Soviet Union to correct the loss that was suffered between 1941 and 1945. Unfortunately, the trauma of the war left many survivors focused on simply trying to rebuild their lives, with little energy left for starting families. It's hard to think about starting a family when you're surrounded by the physical reminders of war. Ruined buildings, mass graves, and vast empty spaces where whole villages once stood. For many, the focus was on putting one foot in front of the other, not on raising children. Despite all this, Stalin pushed forward with rebuilding efforts, demanding even more sacrifices from the population. The Soviet government poured resources into reconstruction, but the process took years. By the 1950s, there was a brief moment of hope with a baby boom. The Soviet Union's total population grew from about 170 million in 1946 to roughly 200 million by 1956. This growth reflected the high birth rates, with around 2.5 to 3 million births each year in the early 1950s. The Soviet government actively encouraged families to have more children, trying to rebuild from the devastation of the war. But even with this surge, they could never fully replace the millions of lives lost between 1941 and 1945. The psychological impact of the war made many hesitant to have large families. After all, they'd seen firsthand how fragile life could be. Fast forward to the 1970s and 1980s, and the Soviet Union was starting to stagnate. The initial optimism of the post-war years started to fade, and the economy began to struggle. Factories built during the era of rapid industrialization became outdated, and the planned economy couldn't keep up with the needs of a modern society. The healthcare system, which had once been a point of pride, started to crumble under the weight of these challenges. Infant mortality rates rose, and life expectancy began to decline. The population, which had grown briefly in the post-war years, now faced new pressures and started dropping again. Then came the 1980s, and with it a new crisis: alcoholism. Vodka was not only cheap and easily accessible, but it was also ingrained in the very fabric of Russian society. The combination of economic struggles and the cultural normalization of heavy drinking caused alcohol consumption to soar, leading to a staggering rise in alcohol-related illnesses and deaths. This directly contributed to the country's worsening demographic decline. Men in particular were hit hard, with skyrocketing rates of alcohol-related diseases like cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, and alcohol poisoning. In some regions, men's life expectancy plummeted to shockingly low levels, with many dying in their 50s or even earlier. By the late 1980s, the average life expectancy for men in Russia had dropped to just 63 years, a decline that paralleled the rise in alcohol consumption. To put this into perspective, in certain parts of the Soviet Union, men were dying at rates typically seen in war zones, not in peacetime nations. In regions like the Russian Far East and Siberia, male life expectancy sank even further, as low as the mid-50s. But to be fair, this wasn't a new problem. Russians had been drinking themselves into early graves long before the Soviet Union existed, going back as far as the days of the ancient Tsars. For centuries, alcohol had been the most common escape for the average Russian citizen, a way to numb the pain of harsh winters, political oppression, and economic instability. During the Soviet era, alcohol was often used as a coping mechanism to endure the grinding realities of life under the regime. Even today, the situation in Russia remains grim. Sure, there's a war going on, but outside of that, there's plenty of food, no widespread famine, and none of the extreme hardships you might expect from a failed state. Yet despite this, the average teenage boy in Russia today still has a lower chance of living to the age of 65 than boys in some of the world's poorest and most war-torn countries, like Somalia or Ethiopia. Even in 2021, before the war, the life expectancy for Russian men was just 67 years, still shockingly low by global standards. So the only difference is that the Russian population has vodka. It might surprise you to learn that, on average, Russians consume a staggering 18 liters of pure alcohol per person each year. To put that into context, that's more than double the maximum amount deemed safe by the World Health Organization, which recommends no more than 8 liters per year. Excessive drinking in Russia has remained one of the country's biggest killers, contributing to as much as 30% of all deaths in the country. Even in times of relative peace and economic stability, Russia's deep-rooted alcohol problem remains one of the biggest factors driving its demographic crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not a new issue. Alcohol has plagued Russian society since the mid-16th century, ever since Ivan the Terrible legalized the sale of vodka as a state-controlled enterprise to raise revenue. From then on, vodka's fueled countless personal tragedies and, on a larger scale, contributed to the decline of an entire nation. From church ceremonies and religious festivals to weddings, political functions, and even business transactions, vodka was the beverage of choice. It was customary, expected, and in many cases, seen as almost obligatory. No significant gathering in Russian society was complete without the clinking of glasses and the familiar burn of vodka. It wasn't just a social lubricant, but also widely believed to possess medicinal qualities. In fact, many Russians used vodka as an antiseptic, an anesthetic, and a treatment for various ailments. If a family member fell ill, a shot of vodka was seen as the remedy. If there was a cause for celebration, vodka was the first thing poured. Church events in particular played a significant role in the ritualized consumption of vodka. It was common at baptisms, funerals, and other religious ceremonies, further embedding alcohol into the cultural and spiritual life of Russians. The church's acceptance of vodka at these events only strengthened its position in society, making it an ever-present element of Russian life. In many ways, vodka wasn't just a drink. It was a tradition, a solution to both sorrow and joy, and a tool for social bonding. Soon, the Russian Tsars recognized the cultural importance of vodka and established a sophisticated system to heavily capitalize. So, over the course of 400 years, they not only controlled the entire vodka market, but also used it as a major source of revenue. By regulating production and distribution, they determined the price of vodka, and in doing so, ensured it was cheap and widely available. The Tsars knew that keeping the population supplied with an endless flow of inexpensive vodka was a means of control. The system established by the Tsars over the course of the next 400 years did more than just foster a cultural dependence on vodka. It became a sophisticated revenue-generating machine. The state controlled the entire vodka market, dictating production and setting prices, ensuring that vodka was not only cheap but also widely available to the masses. The idea was simple. By keeping the population drunk on a constant supply of cheap vodka, the Tsars maintained control over the people. Vodka was, in many ways, a tool of governance. This tactic was particularly effective among the peasants, who often spent what little money they had on vodka. After a few drinks, they were too drunk to think critically about their dire circumstances, too drunk to question why he was living in poverty or how he might improve his lot in life, too drunk to organize or participate in any kind of protest or rebellion. The Tsarist regime understood that a population numbed by alcohol was far less likely to challenge their rule. And so, the vodka monopoly became a cornerstone of the Russian state's control over its citizens. Social events, especially in rural areas, were marked by marathon drinking sessions that often lasted for days. Peasants would attend communal parties, weddings, and religious festivals that seemed never-ending, and with each passing hour came more rounds of vodka. Weddings in particular became notorious for the sheer volume of alcohol consumed. The bride and groom would typically provide 6 to 8 vedros of vodka. That's around 75 to 100 liters, all of which would be consumed before the wedding ceremony even began. At the wedding itself, the bride's family could easily spend up to 200 rubles on vodka alone. To put that in perspective, this was an enormous sum of money, especially for a peasant family. For a poorer family, it could represent months or even an entire year's worth of savings, all spent in one go. This excessive spending on vodka at social gatherings wasn't seen as reckless, but rather it was expected. A social obligation to show respect and ensure the event was properly celebrated. The fact that families would willingly go into debt to provide such quantities of vodka shows just how integral the drink was to Russian peasant life. Vodka also played a major role in countless social and religious events. It's estimated that Orthodox feast days claimed more than 1/3 of the year. That's over 120 days devoted to religious observance, and of course, drinking. As if that weren't enough, they found even more reasons to drink on non-religious occasions. Take, for example, the concept of pomoch. In Russian, pomoch means help, and it referred to one of the major social events in rural Russia, particularly in the countryside. Whenever a peasant found themselves needing extra hands for any kind of task, whether it was harvesting crops, building a barn, or even household chores, they would call for a pomoch. Essentially, this was a work party where friends, families, and neighbors would come together to lend a hand. But here's where things take a strange turn. The workers weren't paid with money. Instead, it was tradition for the host family to pay their helpers in food, and more importantly, vodka. And it wasn't just a small gesture. Providing vodka was considered a key part of hospitality. Before long, these gatherings shifted from being about getting the work done to being more about the drinking itself. Work that could have been completed in a day or two would stretch out for several as the workers became too intoxicated to continue after the first few hours. Instead of helping the community, these events often left people with little to show for their efforts, other than a headache and an empty bottle. So people began to turn to the village youth for help, but that quickly backfired. The pomoch, which was supposed to be about working together, soon became the young people's first introduction to drinking. Even among the youth, the line between work and drinking began to blur, and what started as a tradition of helping out became more of an excuse to indulge in heavy drinking. It's easy to see how the Russian peasantry, and by extension the local economy, was digging its own grave through alcoholism. But the problem didn't stop there. This culture of excessive drinking soon seeped into the national economy as well, especially when alcohol made its way into the workplace. Just as the pomoch tradition encouraged communal drinking in rural areas, there was another term in Russian workplaces, privalno. This was a welcoming ceremony for a new worker joining the team, and as you might guess, it involved vodka, along with some snacks. It wasn't just a casual party to break the ice, but it was an essential part of the onboarding process that solidified the bond between the worker and his colleagues. New hires were expected to drink on their very first day, even while receiving important instructions about their role. It wasn't uncommon for new employees to be so intoxicated that they hardly remembered the tasks they were supposed to learn. This practice turned what should have been a productive and informative first day into a chaotic and unprofessional mess. And it didn't just stop at the first day. Over time, this ceremony evolved into an unwritten rule in many Russian workplaces. Newly hired or newly promoted workers were expected to treat their colleagues to drinks and snacks. If they refused, they risked more than just a bad first impression. They might never acquire the skills they needed to do their job. You see, this wasn't just about drinking, it was about fitting in. If a new worker didn't provide the customary drinks, there was a good chance that his coworkers could intentionally withhold training or support. In some cases, the new hire could be ostracized completely, facing ridicule, name-calling, or even social isolation. It was in the worker's best interest to comply with this tradition, or risk being shut out by his peers. This ritual wasn't just a minor expenditure either. For many workers, it was a serious financial burden. The cost of treating fellow workers to vodka and snacks could range from 200 to 300 rubles, equivalent to several days' wages. And in some cases, workers were forced to spend as much as 800 rubles on a single drinking session. Imagine sacrificing a week's worth of pay just to buy alcohol for your colleagues. The impact of this tradition on the workforce was devastating. For a nation already struggling with productivity and industrial output, the widespread drinking in workplaces led to frequent accidents, injuries, and even fires. Factories in particular became hotspots for alcohol-fueled disasters. Workers who were intoxicated on the job were more prone to mistakes, mishandling equipment, or ignoring safety protocols. This led to frequent accidents, some of which were fatal. So naturally, the culture of drinking led to a general reduction in productivity across many sectors. Workers simply couldn't perform at their best while under the influence, and this had a direct impact on the efficiency of the national economy. By the 1920s, when the communists took control of Russia, the new regime quickly realized that the country's rampant alcohol problem was having a disastrous effect on productivity. The Soviet leadership decided that something had to be done about it. They understood that the country couldn't afford to have its labor force bogged down by drunkenness, especially as they embarked on a massive industrialization campaign. To address this, the Soviet government instituted strict measures to curb alcohol consumption in the workplace. One of their main strategies was to place guards at factory entrances. These guards were tasked with preventing workers from bringing alcohol into the workplace and ensuring that laborers showed up sober. On paper, this seemed like a reasonable solution. After all, a disciplined and sober workforce was critical for achieving the Soviets' ambitious industrial goals. However, in practice, these measures were far less effective than the regime had hoped. While some workers did modify their drinking habits, the deeply ingrained tradition of consuming vodka was hard to break. Laborers found creative ways to sneak alcohol into the factory, often hiding it in personal belongings or stashing bottles in various nooks and crannies around the workplace. Despite the presence of guards, vodka still made its way into the very spaces the government sought to keep alcohol free. The inefficacy of these measures highlighted how deeply entrenched alcohol was in Russian culture, even in the face of strict governmental control. It eventually became a cat-and-mouse game, with workers finding new ways to outwit the guards and continue their drinking traditions. Before the Communist Revolution, hiring practices were largely informal and based on personal connections. Workers were often hired upon the recommendation of an acquaintance, and this came with its own set of unwritten obligations. The newcomer was expected to throw a vodka party for his fellow workers as a way of clearing his debt for being introduced to the job. This created a cycle where new employees had to start their working lives by spending their hard-earned wages on alcohol for their colleagues. However, when the communists came to power, they reformed these hiring practices. The new government believed in a more meritocratic system, where workers were selected based on their skills and qualifications rather than personal connections. They eliminated the expectation that a new worker had to throw a party to repay those who recommended them. Additionally, the Soviets established trade schools run by trade unions, where new workers could receive formal training before entering the workforce. This eliminated the need for veteran workers to train new recruits on the job, reducing the reliance on informal systems of mentorship that were often tied to the consumption of alcohol. By formalizing the training process, the Soviets hoped to create a more professional and productive workforce, free from the distractions of workplace drinking. Yet, despite these reforms, the tradition of privolnaya persisted for decades. It became less about repaying a debt and more about maintaining a long-standing tradition that was hard to shake, despite the government's best efforts. The exact same issue of alcohol consumption and dependence extended into the military, where vodka became a staple not just for celebrations, but as a tool to keep soldiers in check. You might be surprised to learn that there was once a regular vodka ration system in place for both sailors and soldiers, a practice that lasted for many decades. Many in the military considered vodka to be essential, not only for lifting spirits during long and grueling deployments, but also as a means of maintaining morale in the harshest conditions. Whether stationed at the front lines, on naval ships, or in remote military outposts, soldiers were often issued vodka as part of their daily rations. From the early days of Imperial Russia through the Soviet era, commanders believed that alcohol could help manage the stress and fear that came with military life. In World War II, for example, Soviet soldiers were given a daily ration of 100 grams of vodka, referred to as commissar's rations, especially in times of intense fighting. This was believed to boost morale and dull the soldiers' fear before heading into battle. However, as you can imagine, the regular consumption of vodka had serious consequences on the troops' behavior and discipline. Vodka not only impaired soldiers' behavior, but it also encouraged a culture of heavy drinking within the ranks. The more soldiers drank, the more likely they were to engage in disorderly conduct. Drunkenness became a widespread issue, leading to a significant rise in misconduct, including insubordination, theft, and violence. And the problems escalated even further when rations were reduced. When the military authorities attempted to cut down on the amount of vodka distributed, it didn't solve the problem, it made it worse. Soldiers began smuggling vodka into the barracks, finding creative ways to hide their alcohol from commanding officers. This only made matters worse. Instead of moderating their consumption, soldiers resorted to secret drinking, often consuming even more than they had before. The result was an increase in drunkenness, disorder, and a spike in criminal behavior among the troops. Barracks that were already difficult to manage became nearly ungovernable, with fights, accidents, and even desertions on the rise. This created a vicious cycle, especially for new recruits. Upon joining the military, young soldiers were quickly introduced to the drinking culture by their more experienced comrades. Like I've said many times before, it wasn't just expected that they would drink, it was practically mandatory. Refusing to drink with your fellow soldiers wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as an insult. In the tightly knit bonds of military brotherhood, sharing vodka was a way of camaraderie, to prove that you were one of the group. For a new recruit, there was little room to resist the pressure. The expectation to drink with fellow soldiers was so deeply ingrained that failure to do so could lead to social isolation, ridicule, or worse. Many young soldiers had no real choice. They were introduced to alcohol from the moment they arrived, often at their first welcoming ceremony, and it became part of their daily routine. Over time, this led to a troubling cycle. New recruits, eager to fit in and be accepted, would adopt the same drinking habits as their more seasoned comrades. And as they continued down this path, many found themselves becoming alcoholics, trapped in a destructive cycle of dependence that followed them throughout their military careers and often beyond. In 1878, a commanding officer named Butovsky began a detailed investigation into the behavior of new recruits during their first 5 years in military service. His goal was to track the evolution of alcohol consumption among the recruits, from the moment they entered the service until the end of their first enlistment. What he uncovered was alarming evidence and statistics that highlighted the growing issue of alcoholism within the Russian military. According to Butovsky's findings, when recruits first joined the military, 43% of them refused their vodka ration. A surprising statistic that indicated not all recruits were immediately drawn to alcohol. At the same time, about 10% of recruits drank more than their allocated ration, showing early signs of excessive drinking. But over the course of just 1 year, these numbers changed dramatically. A year into their service, only 17% of the recruits were still refusing their vodka rations, while 27% had not only started drinking the rations, but were also consuming extra vodka on the side. Fast forward to 1883, and the situation had worsened considerably. Butovsky's study showed that by this point, only 7% of recruits were abstaining from their vodka ration. Shockingly, more than half of the soldiers were now drinking beyond the rations, consuming additional vodka in secret. Butovsky also noted that the 7% of soldiers who resisted drinking were subjected to heavy bullying and derogatory name-calling by their comrades. Non-drinkers were mockingly referred to as old women or dawdler, highlighting the toxic environment that pressured recruits into joining the drinking culture. By the 1890s, the consequences of this drinking culture became impossible to ignore. Reports of alcohol-related incidents like fights, accidents, and disciplinary issues became more common and even started drawing public attention to the problem. The devastating effects of alcoholism on soldiers' health and behavior were becoming more visible, and the broader public began to demand action. However, despite growing awareness, there was significant resistance within the military to any attempts at reform. Many officers and military leaders believed that vodka played a crucial role in keeping soldiers happy, particularly in times of long deployments and grueling conditions. Some even argued that alcohol had medicinal benefits, especially in harsh climates or during cold weather, where a shot of vodka was believed to warm the body. Still, the public remained unconvinced, so in response, the Russian Society for the Protection of Public Health stepped in and formed a commission to investigate the growing problem. Influential psychiatrists such as M.N. Nizhegorodtsev took a firm stance on the matter. Nizhegorodtsev advocated for the complete elimination of alcohol from military camps and barracks, proposing instead that soldiers be given a daily tea allowance as a healthier alternative. His solution was to introduce recreational activities for the lower-ranking soldiers, such as sports, games, and social events that could distract them from alcohol. But I guess Nizhegorodtsev underestimated that to most Russians, vodka was like tea. So another doctor, P.V. Pudilov, took a more analytical approach to understanding the scope of the problem. He examined injuries and deaths that were likely linked to alcohol consumption, but often went unreported as such. After reviewing cases between 1890 and 1896, Pudilov concluded that alcohol poisoning was the underlying cause of 75% of all ailments suffered by soldiers admitted to medical facilities during that period. Furthermore, Pudilov estimated that between 10 and 44% of all military deaths during that time could be directly linked to alcohol abuse. If Pudilov's figures were accurate, and there's little reason to doubt them, it would suggest that alcohol was playing an absolutely devastating role in the military. Instead of addressing the problem head-on, military officials largely ignored Pudilov's findings. Rather than see alcohol as a poison eroding the health and discipline of their soldiers, they clung to the outdated belief that alcohol gave soldiers spirit, helping them face the hardships of war. This refusal to take the issue seriously would come back to haunt the Russian military in the most humiliating way during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. The Russo-Japanese War, which was supposed to be a demonstration of Russian military might, quickly turned into a disaster, and alcohol was one of the major reasons for the army's failure. The Russian military command sent immense quantities of alcohol to the front lines, believing it would boost morale and keep soldiers steady under pressure. According to one report, the official plan for August 1904 included 300 poods of vodka for an army of 400,000 soldiers to last for 8 months, with an additional 255,000 poods allocated for the following year. To put that into perspective, 1 pood is equal to 16 kilograms, meaning the army received 4.8 million kilograms of vodka. That's an astonishing 12 kilograms of vodka for each of the 400,000 soldiers. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how disastrous this was. With such quantities of vodka readily available, many soldiers became too drunk to fight effectively. In one particularly harrowing incident, Japanese forces reportedly found several thousand Russian soldiers so dead drunk they were able to bayonet them like livestock without encountering any resistance. These scenes of soldiers incapacitated by alcohol became a symbol of the war's failure and the tragic impact of unchecked alcoholism within the ranks. It was after this catastrophic defeat that the military was finally forced to confront the reality of its alcohol problem. The leadership decided to replace vodka rations with lighter beverages, such as beer or wine, in an effort to curb the debilitating effects of heavy drinking on the troops. But this was more of a temporary measure than a long-term solution. By the time the Russian Revolution of 1917 swept across the nation, the country was on the brink of radical change, and so was the role of vodka. When the Bolsheviks seized power and established the Soviet Union, they initially sought to eliminate alcohol from public life, seeing it as a symbol of the oppression of the Tsarist era. For a brief period, vodka was all but eradicated from public life. The Bolsheviks enforced harsh penalties for alcohol production and distribution, hoping to build a new Soviet citizen free from the vices of the old world. But despite these efforts, the ban was far from successful. The demand for alcohol remained high, and black market distilleries began popping up across the country, producing illegal vodka that was often of poor quality and sometimes dangerous to drink. The state couldn't keep up with the sheer scale of illicit alcohol production, and by the 1920s, it became clear that prohibition wasn't working. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, saw an opportunity. Instead of continuing the fight against alcohol, Stalin's government reintroduced vodka as a state-controlled commodity. In 1924, the Soviet government reintroduced vodka as a legal, state-controlled commodity, and by the 1930s, Stalin's government had fully nationalized the production and sale of alcohol. This marked the beginning of one of the most profitable state monopolies in Soviet history. The Soviet Union took control of all alcohol production, reopening old distilleries and constructing new ones to meet the growing demand. Between 1925 and 1930, dozens of new distilleries were built across the country to ramp up production. By 1934, more than 400 state-owned distilleries were in operation, with many producing vodka on an industrial scale. The Soviet government didn't just control production. It also set fixed prices and maintained strict distribution channels to ensure that vodka sales were monopolized by the state. This control allowed the government to set the price of vodka artificially high, maximizing profits. By 1935, vodka sales were generating massive revenue for the Soviet state. The figures were staggering. Vodka alone accounted for nearly 12% of the Soviet Union's total state revenue. The tax on vodka was a key component of this revenue stream. From the late 1920s through the mid-1930s, alcohol taxes were raised multiple times, ensuring that the state captured an ever-growing share of the profits from alcohol sales. By 1937, the revenue from alcohol taxes accounted for approximately 20 to 25% of the entire state budget, an astonishing figure that illustrates just how central vodka had become to the Soviet economy. In terms of raw numbers, the Soviet Union's alcohol revenues skyrocketed. In 1927, the state collected roughly 500 million rubles from alcohol taxes. By 1930, that figure had doubled to around 1 billion rubles, and by the late 1930s, alcohol revenue had reached approximately 6 to 8 billion rubles annually. This massive influx of money was used to fund Stalin's ambitious 5-year plans, which focused on rapid industrialization and military expansion, as we stated earlier. Vodka production didn't even stop during World War II. In fact, vodka was referred to as liquid currency, as the revenue was used to purchase weapons, build tanks, and sustain military logistics. To give you an even clearer picture, by the late 1930s, vodka consumption in the Soviet Union had reached an estimated 3.5 liters of pure alcohol per capita annually. By World War II, this figure had increased to 5 liters per capita. In addition to the taxes collected from vodka sales, the state also introduced excise taxes on other forms of alcohol, further boosting its revenue. By some estimates, alcohol taxes accounted for up to 30% of the Soviet Union's total tax revenue during the 1930s and early 1940s. But all of this came at a massive cost. While the Soviet economy benefited enormously from alcohol revenue, the social consequences were severe. It was estimated that up to 25 to 30% of all deaths in the Soviet Union were attributable to alcohol consumption. The liver was the first organ to suffer. Chronic alcohol abuse leads to conditions such as fatty liver, alcoholic hepatitis, and ultimately cirrhosis, a condition in which the liver becomes scarred and loses its ability to function properly. Cirrhosis is a slow, painful killer, and by the 1950s, cirrhosis of the liver had become one of the leading causes of death among Soviet men. Soviet health statistics from the late 1950s indicated that alcohol-related liver disease was responsible for nearly 10% of male deaths. Excessive vodka consumption also led to cardiovascular issues. Chronic heavy drinking increases blood pressure, weakens the heart muscle, and contributes to the development of arrhythmias and heart attacks. By the 1960s, cardiovascular diseases caused by heavy drinking became a major health crisis in the Soviet Union. Soviet medical reports from the mid-1960s showed that nearly 15% of all cardiovascular deaths were directly linked to excessive alcohol consumption. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the life expectancy of Soviet men began to drop, falling from 65 years to 63 years. This decline was not only due to alcohol-related deaths, including liver disease and alcohol poisoning, but also from increased accidents and violent crimes committed by drunk Soviets. Soviet mortality rates also skyrocketed during this period. By the late 1970s, Soviet men started dying at an alarming rate. The average male life expectancy dropped to 61. This was significantly lower than in other industrialized nations. In some regions, particularly in Siberia and the Russian Far East, male life expectancy was as low as 55 years. Women, on the other hand, had a much higher life expectancy, averaging around 72 years. But this difference created a sharp demographic imbalance, with far more women than men surviving into old age. On one hand, alcoholism was not only killing off Soviet men at a young age, but it was also contributing to a declining birth rate. Many men of childbearing age were either too sick or too incapacitated by alcohol to start families. The physical and mental toll of long-term alcoholism also led to infertility and impotence in many men. Chronic alcohol abuse was found to impair sperm production, leading to lower sperm quality and quantity, which significantly contributed to male infertility during that era. A study found that around 50% of infertility cases were linked to male factors. In severe cases, alcohol led to hormonal imbalances and damage to the reproductive system, further increasing infertility rates. Over the next decade, alcohol-related deaths more than doubled, with tens of thousands of men dying each year from alcohol poisoning alone. Soviet hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of alcohol-induced liver disease, heart attacks, and alcohol poisoning. By 1980, alcohol was responsible for nearly 20% of all male deaths in the Soviet Union. Cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, and alcohol poisoning were the 3 leading alcohol-related causes of death. The Soviet leadership, while aware of the problem, found themselves in a difficult position. The state heavily relied on vodka sales for revenue. By 1975, alcohol taxes made up between 15% and 20% of the Soviet budget. Cutting back on vodka production would mean losing billions in revenue. But at the same time, the cost of alcohol-related social and health problems was growing exponentially. So, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an ambitious anti-alcohol campaign in an attempt to reverse decades of alcohol abuse and its damaging effects on society. The campaign, known as the Dry Law, sought to drastically reduce alcohol consumption by limiting the production and sale of vodka and other spirits. Gorbachev ordered the destruction of vineyards, distilleries, and vodka production facilities. Alcohol sales were restricted to certain hours of the day, and the price of vodka was increased significantly to make it less affordable. Initially, the campaign appeared to be successful. Alcohol consumption dropped by nearly 50% between 1985 and 1987, and alcohol-related deaths fell sharply. Male life expectancy rose for the first time in decades, reaching 65 years by 1987. However, the campaign also had significant unintended consequences. The sharp reduction in legal alcohol production led to a booming black market for homemade vodka, or samogon. Soviet citizens began distilling their own alcohol at home, leading to a surge in alcohol poisoning cases as poorly made samogon often contained dangerous levels of methanol and other toxic substances. The financial impact of Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign was also severe. With legal vodka sales plummeting, the Soviet government lost a significant source of revenue. By 1988, the state budget was facing a shortfall of billions of rubles due to the collapse in alcohol tax revenue. This loss of income further exacerbated the economic crisis that was already brewing in the Soviet Union, contributing to the weakening of the Soviet economy in the years leading up to its collapse. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia faced an unprecedented economic crisis. The sudden transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based system led to rampant inflation, widespread poverty, and the collapse of many state industries. The healthcare system, which had once been publicly funded, began to disintegrate, and access to basic medical care became severely limited. As a result, Russia experienced a sharp decline in living standards, and the health of its population deteriorated. Now let's take a look at the state the Soviet Union left its population in. By 1991, Russia's birth rate was already on the decline, largely due to decades of alcohol abuse, poor healthcare, and economic struggles. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things got even worse. By 1999, Russia's birth rate had hit a record low, just 8.3 births per 1,000 people, down from around 13 per 1,000 in 1990. In 1991, the average life expectancy for Russian men was about 64 years. However, by 1994, it had plummeted to just 57 years. Women, on the other hand, fared a little better, but their life expectancy also fell from 74 years in 1991 to around 71 by 1994. The post-Soviet years clearly took a heavy toll on the population. Then Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, but his tenure was marked by political instability, economic hardship, and widespread corruption. Yeltsin's government implemented a series of economic reforms known as shock therapy, which involved the rapid privatization of state assets and the liberalization of prices. While these reforms were intended to jumpstart the Russian economy, they instead led to hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small group of oligarchs. Deaths from alcohol didn't change and still remained around 30%. Then, in 1999, Vladimir Putin came to power following Yeltsin's resignation, and his presidency marked a period of relative political stability and economic recovery. Under Putin's leadership, the Russian government took significant steps to reduce alcohol consumption. New regulations were introduced to restrict the sale of alcohol, including banning the sale of vodka during certain hours and raising the minimum price of alcohol to make it less affordable. The government also cracked down on the production and sale of illegal vodka, which had become a major problem during the 1990s. In addition, public health campaigns were launched to raise awareness about the dangers of excessive drinking. According to the World Health Organization, these efforts had a noticeable impact. Between 2003 and 2018, alcohol consumption in Russia fell by 43%. By 2015, the average Russian adult was consuming around 10 liters of pure alcohol per year, down from the peak of 18 liters in the mid-1990s. As a result, life expectancy began to rise. By 2019, the average life expectancy for men had increased to 68 years, and for women it had reached 78 years. In addition to addressing alcohol consumption, the Putin government also introduced policies aimed at reversing the country's demographic decline. One of the most notable of these policies was the introduction of the Maternity Capital Program in 2007, which provided financial incentives for families to have more children. This policy, along with economic stabilization, led to a modest increase in the birth rate during the late 2000s and early 2010s. By 2013, the birth rate had risen to 13.3 births per 1,000 people, up from the low of 8.3 per 1,000 in 1999. However, these gains were short-lived. By the mid-2010s, the birth rate began to decline again, and by 2020, it had fallen to 10.1 births per 1,000 people. This demographic decline has been exacerbated by Russia's aging population and a shrinking workforce, both of which are legacies of the demographic crises of the 1990s and early 2000s. Then, Putin just made everything worse by invading Ukraine in February 2022. The war has triggered a massive exodus of educated, skilled, and wealthy Russians, leading to what's commonly referred to as a brain drain. Many young professionals, including doctors, engineers, and IT specialists, have fled the country due to fears of conscription, economic sanctions, and the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin regime. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 1 million Russians have left the country since the start of the war, many of whom were highly educated and part of the professional class. This brain drain will have long-term consequences for Russia's economy and its ability to compete on the global stage. The loss of highly skilled workers will make it difficult for Russia to innovate, particularly in industries such as technology, medicine, and engineering. As the country loses its best and brightest, it'll face increasing challenges in maintaining its economic and military strength, especially as Western sanctions continue to bite. The war in Ukraine has also had a direct impact on Russia's demographics. In 2022, it was reported that many of the soldiers sent to fight in Ukraine were from poorer, rural regions of Russia where the demographic situation was already fragile. These regions, particularly in the Caucasus and Siberia, have been hit hard by the war, as young men are either killed in combat or return home with severe injuries, reducing their ability to contribute to the economy or start families. But from Putin's perspective, this war makes sense in terms of demographics. You see, the timing of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was particularly crucial for Russia. By that year, many of Russia's young men were reaching the age of military service, creating a fleeting window for the government to draw from a relatively stable pool of fighting-age men. This demographic window was critical because Russia's population pyramid, essentially the age structure of the population, has been steadily shifting, with fewer young people coming of age each year due to the long-term demographic decline Russia's been experiencing since the 1990s. Russia's population pyramid, when viewed in detail, shows an increasingly top-heavy structure, which means there are more elderly citizens and fewer young people. In the 1990s, Russia's birth rate plummeted and the country faced a steep population decline. As a result, fewer children were born during that period, creating a gap in the younger age cohorts that's now starting to show its impact. The children born during the early post-Soviet years, those in the 1990s, are now the young adults of today, and their numbers are far smaller compared to previous generations. For a healthy, growing population, the base of the pyramid is wide, representing a large number of children and young adults, and it narrows as it moves upward, indicating fewer elderly people. In Russia's case, however, the pyramid has a constricted base and a bulging middle, reflecting a high proportion of middle-aged and elderly individuals and a shrinking pool of younger people. This generation, now in their mid-20s to early 30s, provided the bulk of Russia's fighting force for the Ukraine invasion. However, had Putin delayed the invasion for several more years, the demographic situation would have worsened to the point where Russia might not have had enough fighting-age men to sustain a large-scale military operation. This demographic shift is often described as a demographic cliff because it represents a sharp decline in the number of young people available to serve in the military. By 2025 or 2030, the majority of the young men who formed the backbone of Russia's fighting force in 2022 would have aged out of the military service range, moving into their 30s and 40s. At the same time, the next generation of recruits, those born after the mid-1990s, would be smaller in number, providing a far less robust pool of conscripts or professional soldiers. But this war will also have a massive impact on Russia's demographics. Thousands of Russian soldiers have already been killed in the conflict, and many more have been wounded. Every young man lost in the war represents a future father, a worker, and a member of the community, further shrinking the already limited pool of potential recruits and economic contributors. As it stands, the war's accelerating Russia's demographic decline, and the loss of life on the battlefield, combined with the brain drain of young professionals, will have long-lasting consequences for the country's military and economic future. Over the next decade, Russia's aging population and shrinking youth cohort will present significant challenges, further weakening its position on the global stage.